Resident Evil has, perhaps more than any other series, defined itself by its ability to reimagine itself. Many franchises branch out, many change their style of presentation, but a truly admirable thing about Resident Evil is that it has, historically, been the trendsetter, not the chaser. The original Resident Evil set the model for how fixed camera-angled, tank-controlled survival horror games would work in the 5th generation. Then, with Resident Evil 4, the series also set the framework for third-person action games entering the 7th generation. Much has stayed the same as the series has grown and much has changed, but I find it interesting to ponder the seemingly inconspicuous elements of flesh and danger. Both of these are, and have always been, core components to these games, but the mechanics of how they work is not uniform across the series, and I find it fascinating to ponder how the times have imposed restrictions on how each game went about presenting both. I haven't played every Resident Evil game, but I've played most of the mainline titles, and as a fan of tank-controlled survival horror games, I found it really enlightening to go back to RE1 not that long ago to see where the template came from. Yeah, I know that technically Sweet Home exists, but come on, we both know which game the industry took its cues from. What I found fascinating about RE1 was that almost every conceptualization of how to present danger with a tank control framework was more or less thought through here. Tank controls are a great way to give the player a sense of physicality. You really feel your character is in a location when moving around in it takes so much effort. But rather than make compromises for an experimental control setup created back when 3D was still a novelty, Resident Evil 1 wisely leans into that physicality. Tight corridors, which force you to exhaust your ammunition to kill enemies or risk running. An interwoven level design which encourages repeat visits through areas, something the remake made brilliant use of with the introduction of the Crimson Heads. And since the camera angle on hallways often cuts midway through them, retreating to relative safety to take aim at the enemy often means you're going to have a less than optimal camera angle, so you have to sort of intuit how safe you really are. You trade certainty for safety. Resident Evil 2 feels a bit more action-oriented than the first game, to me, but the stuff it needed to get right in this department, it got right. I'm particularly a fan of the zombies, which reach in through the boarded-up windows, a nice way to add a different kind of danger to an area. RE2 still knows how to drum up spooks with camera angles, as does the third game. Great fundamentals would have been enough to carry these games as they kept being made, but at some point it was decided to go into a different direction. Enter RE4. The freer roaming camera means skill is a bigger factor in combat, meaning damage comes from timing your shots and strikes to congeal the best with enemy animations. So, let's talk a bit about flesh. Old RE had to contend with low-resolution displays, low processing power from the console, while still having to make the game instruct the players on how to play. If you've ever wondered why enemy animations in the old REs are as wildly exaggerated as they are, consider that the presentation would have originally looked more like this. And players needed to know what was going on. To accomplish that, the enemies are designed in a very utilitarian way, but there's something else to note with the CRT filter on, which often goes neglected. The textures used on the models are very primitive, but they still needed to clearly present zombies and other assorted monsters. So, much like how these games embraced their cumbersome physicality emphasizing movement scheme, they also embraced these limitations, opting for a visual style which infers the grotesque rather than try to show it. The placement of a single pixel can mean a lot when the texture resolution is so low, and the injuries and physical deformities on the monsters use this to get the viewer to mentally fill in the blanks to overcome the limitations of the presentation. The jittery nature of 3D models from the PlayStation 1 also helps to sell the unnatural biology of the monsters. And old RE had a very beautiful evolution on this front. Moving from somewhat generic and, let's face it, uninspired zombie designs in RE1 to specialized ones in RE2. Enemies like the Lickers also show up to fill the RE universe's Monsterpedia manual up with more of its own creations, less giant spiders or snakes. And on this front, RE3 did not underdeliver. It ramps up the action even further, it embraces the chaotic and jettisons all pretense of being a subdued survival horror game, especially compared to its immediate predecessors. Being that this game is sort of the natural conclusion of the amping up of the combat for early RE, it was, fittingly, here where I noticed something about the old RE blood splatters which I never noticed before, even though it was there from the start. Because we are dealing with such a low-resolution display, effects need to pop in order to be visible. For blood splatters, that means this. Yeah, it's big. But more than that, because of the way it's animated, with several pixel segments rather than simulated liquid, it acquires a sort of chunky quality, which I think really amps up the grotesque physicality of the violence. And the physicality of the violence is where RE4 is king. Not just in this franchise, by the way, but maybe even industry-wide. Because we can now manipulate the camera, the enemy's animations have to account for a gun being pointed at them. They'll swoop to the sides to avoid our aiming reticule, they'll throw axes or dynamite at us, and because we're still dealing with a transitional movement scheme from tank controls to 360-degree analog stick control, our mobility in combat is handicapped, which makes for a lot of really good stressful moments. Since the camera is no longer fixed, camera angles are no longer as reliable to direct the player or the combat, so the game leans into its clunky movement scheme. You know why headshots open enemies up for the roundhouse kicks which deal splash damage to everything in your vicinity? It's because a freer camera disincentivizes risky head-on encounters. But because the game is still doing ammo scarcity, and because the gun no longer snaps to the closest creature when pulled up, there needed to be alternate ways of dealing damage. Also, since the camera angles are not reliable to create tense combat encounters, the double whammy is in the roundhouse kick. It's there to get us to expose ourselves. It's always good to get it off, and it's balanced around distance. If you activate the headshot trigger from too far away, you've probably just wasted that shot, but if you're too close, maybe trying to activate it isn't the best strategy. There's a bit of tug, allowing for some miscalculations on the player's behalf. Those sorts of uncertain moments are how the combat keeps us on our toes. See also how sometimes headshots will not open up the roundhouse kick, but will just have the shot enemy's head explode. Another way the physicality of danger is handled differently this time around is that there are fewer dead ends here. We can often jump out of a window or something to create distance. This combat system is thoroughly engaging, but like the previous one, it creates some restrictions on exactly what the monsters can/cannot do for the game to play well. For one, they are usually slow to give us time to align the aiming reticule. This is one of those things you don't necessarily think about when playing, but try going back to RE4 without noticing how sluggish all of the enemies are. It doesn't stick out because it's well implemented, which is notable because the monster variety on display is really expansive. In the beginning, enemies are just grunt villagers. The most exciting thing they do is throw stuff at us to break our aim and stagger us, allowing for the clustered groups to get some hits in. There's also the chainsaw guys who force us to move around the map since one hit from them means death. As the game goes on, the presentation of corrupted flesh is expanded upon with those guys who, instead of having their heads explode from headshots, will grow that X tendril thing that expands the range of their attacks, a fun take on physical danger. There's also the ticking time bomb. Leon and Ashley are both infected with a virus which will eventually render both of them under the control of the game's villain, so this time around we see the idea of corrupt flesh being internalized. And Ashley, oh my god, I love this character. Adding a partner for us to defend is such a great way to amplify the gamification of physicality and danger, since you now need to keep her in mind as well. When we find her, we are pretty much equipped enough to take on anything in our way. Plus, the combat should be ingrained enough that you can start chasing style points. But because we have to keep her safe, we have to pursue suboptimal avenues for dealing damage to maximize her well-being. The biggest difference in presentation style from old RE to RE4 is that to deal damage, you have to interact with the enemy in more varied, more direct ways, and these just so happen to usually showcase the corruption of flesh. Looking at monsters through the crosshairs, dropping those liquid nitrogen tankers on the alien predator mantis thing to freeze it. There's fighting Rasputin, who turns into John Carpenter's The Thing, carefully aiming the rifle to destroy the parasites on the regenerators. There's Krauser's corrupted hand. You get the idea. Flesh and danger are more integrated in RE4 than in its predecessors because you have to engage with both more directly and in more varied ways. Old RE combat was about maximizing your distance from the monsters while still being able to deal damage. It leaned into the uncertainty of not seeing the danger. Resident Evil 4 is also largely about this distance, but it's about vividly seeing the danger. RE4 unified the dispersed ideas of its era into the basis for third-person action games. It's a masterpiece, but its greatness is also kind of a problem for the series. Every single aspect of RE4 was dissected and elaborated on in the games it inspired, so pretty quickly this formula runs out of steam and things can begin to feel stagnant. Full disclosure, I've never played Resident Evil 5 or 6. They could be great, they could be terrible, I don't know. But whatever their quality, by the time 7 rolls around, the series has to reinvent itself again. Maybe it was the critical underperformance of 5 and 6, maybe it was the oversaturation of the third-person action game market, maybe it was PT market-proving to the suits that big-budget horror games are viable, maybe it was the strong performance of the PC and Wii releases of the old RE library. Whatever the case, Resident Evil reinvents itself once again, and far from the over-the-top Sam Raimi gorefest of yesteryear, things take a dive into Texas Chainsaw Massacre territory. At least, for a while, the series couldn't resist dipping its toes back into its bread and butter, but for those opening hours, the presentation of danger is completely different from before. First of all, the first-person camera perspective makes the threats more intimate. And there are many moments which take advantage of the intimacy of this display setup. That's Ethan being force-fed, that rotten crap, having his hand chainsawed off, etc. As for combat, much of what worked last time around is back. Enemies still dodge away from the aiming reticule, but this time around the roundhouse kick splash attack is out. See, the first-person perspective narrows the FOV so significantly that you don't need the player to expose themselves to make things tense. The tension comes from not seeing your sights or back. Another big change which the first-person camera brought with it is the increase in grab attacks. Those used to be how the games signaled that you failed to keep your distance, and that's still their purpose here, but since the developers know for a fact what we'll be looking at when we're grabbed from this perspective, they could put some elbow grease into the grab animations to really drive home the corrupt physiology of the enemies and amp up the visceral nature of the violence. We've come a long way from the chunky blood splatters of RE1, and the importance of monster animations has been amplified with each game. When so much of your success in combat comes from knowing what to do, comes from timing your shots correctly, and less from being far away from the enemies, like in old RE, attention to detail in what the animations communicate is really important to not only tell the player what's happening in front of them, but also to show the player that the world is responding to their input. My favorite example of this is something I first noticed in RE2 Remake, and that's how, when you headshot a zombie, its head will ungracefully snap back. It's a fun juxtaposition between soft and hard flesh. The skull is hard, so when it's shot, it will break, but the neck is soft, so when you headshot someone, the shot being absorbed is represented with this really beautiful little piece of rubbery animation. You can also tear zombies to pieces by shooting specific parts of their bodies, and this juxtaposition between soft and hard flesh is even maintained in the non-zombie enemies. One of my personal favorite showcases of this being in Heisenberg's factory of metal monster hybrids. Check these drill guys out. They cover their weak spot until they attack, meaning you need to risk letting them come close in order to deal damage to them, and That the weak point is actually incorporated into the design is very Resident Evil. It's in the oversized eyes of bosses in previous games, it's in the parasites on the regenerators, and another great showcase of this is in what is possibly my favorite RE8 thing, the propeller head monster. And going back to the juxtaposition of soft and hard flesh, this guy is an absolute banger. By the nature of its brand, and because it had to reimagine itself as often as it has to stay relevant, Resident Evil might have done more than any series in experimenting with the conceptualization of physical danger and the game feel of flesh. And I can't wait to see what Capcom has in store next. Also in RE3 Remake, Carlos's chest pouches have jiggle physics.